The night was black. So black that even the men huddled in the ditch couldn't see their own fingers. But they could hear everything. The slow, growing roar of Daimler-Benz engines, the tremble of the earth as German aircraft circled like metal vultures. Every man knew what was coming. A single strafing run could wipe out all 80 of them. They had no anti-aircraft guns, no radio, no cover, only a broken Jeep and one headlight that still worked. Their sergeant wiped the mud from his face and stared into the darkness. He could hear his men whispering prayers. No one expected to live another minute. Then the sergeant did something insane. Something no manual had ever written. He took that one working Jeep headlight, lifted it into the night, and pointed it at the sky. What happened next would fool the Luftwaffe and save every man's life. 24 hours earlier, the platoon had been moving fast through the French countryside, their convoy stretched thin along a muddy road that cut through farmland abandoned months ago. It was late autumn, 1944, the kind of cold that gets inside your bones and stays there. Sergeant William Hatcher rode in the lead Jeep, his collar turned up against the wind, watching the tree line with eyes that never stopped moving. They'd been detached from their main unit 3 days prior, a reconnaissance mission that had gone sideways when German forces appeared where intelligence said they wouldn't be. Now they were racing back to friendly lines, hoping to outrun the darkness and whatever else might be hunting them in it. Hatcher was 32 years old, a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania who'd been in the Army since '42. He wasn't the kind of sergeant who yelled or postured. His men followed him because he was steady, because when things went wrong, and they always went wrong, Hatcher found a way through. He had a wife back home named Dorothy, a daughter he'd only seen in photographs. He carried their picture in his breast pocket, wrapped in wax paper to keep it dry. Behind him, spread across 2 trucks and 3 Jeeps, rode 40 men. Good men, farm boys and factory workers, clerks and mechanics. Private First Class Danny Reeves, 19 years old, who still wrote letters to his mother every week. Corporal James Mitchell, a former teacher who quoted Shakespeare when he was nervous. Tech Sergeant Paul Novak, who could fix any engine but couldn't read a map to save his life. These weren't heroes from the newsreels. They were just men trying to get home alive. The sun was dropping fast, painting the horizon blood orange when the first truck coughed black smoke and rolled to a stop. Novak jumped out, swearing under his breath, already covered in grease. Hatcher climbed down from his Jeep and walked back, his boots squelching in the mud. "Fuel pump's shot," Novak said, not looking up. "I can patch it, but it'll take time." Hatcher looked at the sky. Maybe 40 minutes of light left. They were exposed here, visible for miles in any direction. Every instinct told him to move, but you don't leave men behind. You don't split the unit. "How much time?" he asked. "An hour. Maybe more." The men climbed down from the vehicles, stretching cramped legs, lighting cigarettes with cupped hands. They joked quietly, the way soldiers do when they're trying not to think about danger. Someone passed around a canteen. Mitchell recited a few lines from Macbeth about tomorrow, and Reeves told him to shut up with the gloomy stuff. But Hatcher wasn't listening to them. He was listening to something else, something distant. A low hum that didn't belong to the wind or the trees. He held up his hand. The men went quiet. There it was again, faint but unmistakable. Aircraft engines, multiple engines, coming from the northeast. "Everyone off the road," Hatcher said quietly. "Now." They moved fast, pulling the vehicles into a drainage ditch, covering them with branches and canvas tarps. The men scattered into the brush, pressing themselves into the mud, rifles ready, even though they all knew small arms fire wouldn't do a damn thing against a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf. The sound grew louder. Hatcher counted 3 distinct engine signatures. Recon patrol probably. Luftwaffe pilots searching for Allied movements, radioing coordinates back to bomber groups. If they were spotted, they'd be hit within the hour. The planes passed overhead, gray shadows against the darkening sky, and kept going. The men waited 10 more minutes before emerging, covered in mud, shaking for more than just the cold. Novak got back to work on the truck. The minutes crawled. The light died. Hatcher stood beside his jeep, watching the darkness swallow the road, feeling the weight of every decision pressing down on him. They should have reached friendly lines by now, should have been safe. Instead, they were stranded in the open, waiting for mechanical luck and hoping the night would hide them. By the time Novak finished, it was full dark. No moon, no stars, just blackness so complete it felt like drowning. "We can't drive without headlights," Mitchell said. "We'll drive straight off the road." "And if we use headlights, we're target practice," Reeves added. Hatcher knew they were both right. He looked down at his Jeep's headlights. One was smashed from earlier fighting. The other still worked, though barely. He ran his hand over the glass, feeling the warmth from the filament inside. "Mount up," he said finally. "No lights. We go slow. Real slow. Novak, you guide from the running board. We stop if we have to." They rolled forward at 5 miles per hour, Novak hanging off the side of the lead truck, calling out turns and obstacles. It was nerve-shredding work. Every minute felt like an hour. And then they heard it again. Engines. Closer this time. Much closer. Hatcher raised his fist. The convoy stopped. The men listened. This wasn't a patrol passing overhead. This was something hunting. The engine sounds moved in deliberate patterns, circling, searching, doubling back. The Luftwaffe had spotted something. Maybe tire tracks in the mud, maybe heat signatures from the cooling engines, maybe just a hunch. "Out," Hatcher whispered. "Everyone out. Into the ditches." They abandoned the vehicles and scrambled into the shallow trenches on either side of the road. The ground was freezing mud that soaked through their uniforms immediately. They pressed themselves flat, rifles beside them, useless metal and wood that offered no comfort. The engine sounds grew louder. Hatcher could feel it in his chest now, that deep vibration that meant something big and powerful was close. He thought about Dorothy, about his daughter, about the letter he'd written 2 days ago that was still folded in his pocket, unstamped, unsent. Beside him, Reeves was shaking. Not from fear exactly, though there was plenty of that, but from the cold and the exhaustion and the terrible mathematics of war that said most of them wouldn't see Christmas. "We're gonna be okay," Hatcher whispered. He didn't know if it was true, but it was what Sargent said. "We're gonna be okay." But the engines kept circling, and the darkness kept pressing in, and every man in that ditch knew they were running out of time. The fear in the dark is different from the fear in daylight. In daylight, you can see what's trying to kill you. You can aim, you can run, you can fight, but in this darkness complete, you're blind, helpless. Every sound becomes a threat. Every shadow becomes death. Hatcher lay in the mud and tried to think like the Luftwaffe pilots overhead. They were professionals, combat veterans who'd been flying night operations for years. They knew how to read the ground, how to spot Allied movements, how to distinguish between trees and trucks, between rocks and men. They were trained to look for light, any light, a cigarette, a flashlight, a vehicle headlamp, even the faint glow of instruments in a cockpit. Light meant targets. The engines separated. One plane moved east, another held position overhead. A third, the sound was different now, heavier, circled wide to the south. They were boxing the platoon in, coordinating, preparing for something. Mitchell crawled closer to Hatcher. "Top, what's the play here?" Hatcher didn't answer immediately. He was watching the sky, or rather watching where he thought the sky should be, trying to track the aircraft by sound alone. The main plane overhead was definitely a bomber. You could tell by the engine rhythm, the labored, powerful throb of something carrying heavy ordnance. "They're deciding if we're worth the fuel," Hatcher said quietly. "If they spot us, they'll light us up with flares and then machine gun the whole area. If they don't see anything, they'll move on. So we just wait?" "We wait." But waiting felt like dying slowly. Hatcher could hear his men breathing, quick, shallow breaths that fogged in the freezing air. Someone was praying in Spanish, someone else was crying, very softly, trying to muffle it in the mud. These were good soldiers. They'd fought through Normandy, through the Bocage country, through a dozen firefights that should have killed them. But this was different. There was no enemy to shoot at, no objective to take, just darkness and machines and the certainty that they were outmatched. Hatcher turned his head and looked at the Jeep, abandoned 10 feet away. The broken headlight was shattered glass, but the working one was intact, its lens catching the faintest reflection of starlight that penetrated the cloud cover. An idea began forming. Crazy, probably suicidal, but maybe, just maybe, crazy enough to work. The Luftwaffe pilots were trained to interpret lights. That was their weakness and their strength. They knew what runway lights looked like, what anti-aircraft searchlights looked like, what convoy headlights looked like from 10,000 feet. But what if you showed them a light they couldn't quite figure out? What if you created confusion instead of clarity? Hatcher crawled to Mitchell. "I need you to do exactly what I say. No questions." Mitchell nodded. "When I give the signal, you run to that Jeep. You open the hood, you disconnect the headlight from the main circuit and wire it directly to the battery. Can you do that in the dark?" I think so." "Why?" "Just trust me." Hatcher crawled down the ditch, moving from man to man, whispering instructions. "Stay flat. Don't move. When you see the light, don't panic. Trust the plan." The men looked at him like he'd lost his mind, but they nodded. They'd follow him into hell if he asked. That's what good soldiers did. The bomber overhead made another pass, lower this time. Hatcher could see its silhouette now, a Heinkel, probably, or maybe a Junkers 88, the kind of plane that could carry enough incendiaries to turn the whole field into an inferno. It was now or never. "Mitchell," Hatcher whispered. "Go." Mitchell moved like a shadow, crawling on his belly through the mud, reaching the Jeep, pulling himself up under the hood. Hatcher could hear him working, the soft click of tools, the whisper of wire on metal. 30 seconds. A minute. The bomber circled again. Then, a spark. A flicker. And suddenly the Jeep headlight blazed to life, brilliant and shocking in the absolute darkness. Every man in the ditch flinched. It felt like treason, like surrender, like painting a target on all of them. But Hatcher was already moving. He grabbed the headlight assembly, still hot, burning his hands through his gloves, and lifted it free from the Jeep. The wires stretched. The battery connection held. He stood up in the open field and pointed the light at the sky. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The beam cut upward through the darkness, like a searchlight, wavering slightly in Hatcher's trembling hands. He could feel 40 pairs of eyes on him, could feel his men holding their breath, could feel the weight of the gamble he just made with all their lives. The bomber's engine note changed. It banked hard, turning toward them. Hatcher's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced himself to stay calm, to think. He angled the beam slightly, sweeping it across the sky in a slow, deliberate arc, the exact motion of an anti-aircraft predictor light trying to acquire a target. The bomber hesitated. That hesitation was everything. From the pilot's perspective, 10,000 feet up, what did he see? A single light source behaving like military equipment, but not matching any known Allied installation or convoy pattern. The bomber circled once more, warily, then gained altitude. One of the fighter escorts swooped lower, its engine screaming as it dove. Hatcher's instinct screamed at him to run, to drop the light and dive for cover, but he held steady. He changed the angle of the beam, pointing it outward now instead of upward, sweeping it back and forth across the field. From above, it might look like a moving convoy, multiple vehicles with headlights, maybe even armored units with anti-aircraft capability. The fighter pulled up without firing. Hatcher's arms were shaking from the weight of the headlight. Sweat poured down his face despite the freezing temperature. He could taste copper in his mouth, fear or exertion, or both. The third plane, another fighter, made a wide pass. Hatcher tracked it with the beam, then deliberately switched the light off for 3 seconds. Off, on, off, on. The pattern of a signal lamp, a coded message to non-existent friendly aircraft or ground units. The Germans had to be confused now. Nothing about this made tactical sense. A lone light source in the middle of nowhere, behaving like military equipment, but not matching any known Allied installation or convoy pattern. The bomber made a decision. It dropped flares. 2 brilliant magnesium stars burst overhead, floating slowly on tiny parachutes, turning night into harsh white day. The whole field was illuminated. The abandoned vehicles, the ditches, the men pressed flat and motionless. Hatcher dropped the headlight and threw himself into the mud. Every instinct screamed that they were dead. The flares would reveal everything. The planes would see them. The machine guns would open up. But nothing happened. The flares drifted. The planes circled. And then, incredibly, impossibly, they turned away. The Luftwaffe formation broke apart and flew northeast back towards German territory. For 10 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. Then someone sobbed. Someone else laughed, high and hysterical. The sound spread through the platoon, relief and shock and disbelief mixing together.
Hatcher lay in the mud, staring up at the dying flares, and felt something break inside him. Not collapse, exactly, more like release. The terrible tension that had been holding him together for days suddenly let go, and he found himself shaking uncontrollably. Mitchell crawled over to him. Top, you okay?" Hatcher nodded, not trusting his voice. I don't even know what that was. That was stupid. That was the stupidest thing I've ever done. That was the bravest thing I've ever seen." But Hatcher shook his head. It wasn't bravery. It was desperation. It was mathematics. It was a sergeant doing what sergeants do, making impossible choices and living with the consequences. The flares burned out. Darkness returned. And for the first time in hours, the darkness felt like safety instead of threat. Reeves approached him, his face streaked with mud and tears. "Sarge, you saved us! You actually saved us!" "We're not safe yet," Hatcher said, forcing himself to sit up. His hands were blistered from the hot headlight. His uniform was soaked through. "We need to move. Now, before they send ground units to investigate." The men moved like ghosts, remounting the vehicles, covering the headlights with cloth. Novak got the truck started on the second try. They rolled forward through the darkness, still without lights, still vulnerable, but alive. They drove for 2 hours, navigating by starlight and pure instinct, before Hatcher finally called a halt. They'd put enough distance between themselves and the encounter site. The men collapsed where they stood, too exhausted to set up proper camp. Hatcher sat with his back against a tree, staring at nothing. Mitchell brought him coffee from someone's thermos, lukewarm and bitter, but better than nothing. "You know they're not going to believe this," Mitchell said. "Who's not going to believe what?" "Command, when we report. They're going to think we made it up." Hatcher sipped the coffee. "Maybe. Doesn't matter. It matters to me. You should get a medal. Hell, you should get a ticker tape parade." "I should get court-martialed for unauthorized use of equipment," Hatcher said with a tired smile. "But I'll settle for getting these men home." Mitchell sat beside him. "How'd you even think of it? The headlight thing?" Hatcher didn't answer right away. "How do you explain instinct? How do you describe the way your mind works when death is seconds away and you're responsible for 40 lives? I thought about what they were looking for," he said finally. "They were looking for patterns, things that made sense. So I showed them something that didn't quite make sense, something that would make them hesitate, and hesitation was all we needed." "That's genius." "That's luck. But it was more than luck, and they both knew it. It was understanding. It was empathy. It was the ability to think like your enemy and anticipate their training, their doctrine, their decision trees. Hatcher hadn't outsmarted the Luftwaffe with superior technology or firepower. He'd outsmarted them with psychology. Around them, the men slept, deep, dreamless sleep born of exhaustion and relief. He envied them. He knew he wouldn't sleep tonight. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that bomber circling overhead, felt the weight of the headlight in his hands, heard the engine notes changing. By dawn, they were moving again. The landscape was different now, more open, with signs of recent Allied activity. They passed burned-out German positions, abandoned equipment, the debris of a war that was slowly, painfully turning in the Allies' favor. They reached friendly lines just after noon, a checkpoint manned by MPs who looked at them like they'd seen ghosts. "We had you listed as MIA, maybe KIA. Where the hell have you been?" "Lost," Hatcher said simply. They were processed through, given hot food and clean uniforms, debriefed by intelligence officers who wanted to know everything: routes, enemy positions, strength estimates. Hatcher told them everything except the part about the headlight. That felt too strange, too unbelievable. But word spread anyway. Soldiers talk, stories get embellished. By evening, half the camp knew about the sergeant who'd fooled the Luftwaffe with a Jeep headlight. An officer came to find Hatcher, a captain with a neat uniform and skeptical eyes. "Is it true?" he asked. "Is what through, sir?" "This business with the light. You really pull that off?" Hatcher looked at him, thought about lying, thought about playing it down. But 40 men were alive because of what happened in that field, and they deserved to have their story told truthfully.
"Yes, sir," he said. "We were pinned down. No options. I used a headlight to create confusion. Made them think we were something we weren't. They broke off the attack." The captain studied him for a long moment. "That's either very clever or very foolish." "Probably both, sir. You're not getting a medal. Didn't expect one. But you're not getting a reprimand either. Sometimes the book doesn't have answers. Sometimes you have to improvise. You brought your men home. That's what matters." The captain left. Hatcher sat alone in the mess tent, drinking coffee that was actually hot this time, and thought about Dorothy and his daughter. He'd write them tonight, tell them he was safe, leave out the parts that would give them nightmares. Mitchell found him later. "Some of the boys want to buy you a drink, Top." "I don't drink," Hatcher said. "Neither do most of them, but tonight feels like a night for exceptions." They gathered in a corner of the camp, the survivors of that night in the field, 40 men who'd been given a second chance. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. They just sat together, sharing a bottle of something that tasted like gasoline, and remembered what it felt like to be alive when they should have been dead. Reeves raised his cup. "To the Sarge." The men echoed it. "To the Sarge." Hatcher shook his head. "To all of us," he said. "We did that together." And in a way that was true. He'd come up with the plan, but they'd trusted him. They'd stayed quiet when every instinct screamed to run. They believed in him, even when he barely believed in himself. That's what makes an army work. Not the generals or the grand strategy, but the trust between soldiers. The belief that the person next to you will do their job. That when things go wrong, someone will figure out a way through. Hatcher had figured out a way through. Not with courage, though there was courage. Not with training, though training helped. But with ingenuity, with understanding, with the desperate creativity of a man who refused to let his soldiers die. The war continued. The platoon was reassigned. They fought through Belgium, through the Ardennes during the coldest winter anyone could remember, into Germany itself as the Reich collapsed. Some of the men from that night didn't make it. War is like that, random and merciless. Reeves took shrapnel at Bastogne. Novak drove over a mine outside Cologne. One by one, the numbers dwindled. But they remembered. On cold nights, huddled in foxholes or abandoned buildings, the survivors would tell the story. About the sergeant and the headlight. About the night they should have died but didn't. The story changed in the telling, got bigger, more dramatic. In some versions there were 20 planes. In others, Hatcher held off the Luftwaffe for an hour. The details blurred and shifted the way memories do. But the core remained true. One man, one light, one impossible gamble that paid off. Hatcher never talked about it. When asked, he'd shrug and change the subject. He didn't think of himself as a hero. Heroes were the men who charged machine gun nests or threw themselves on grenades. He'd just been a sergeant doing his job, keeping his men alive. The war ended in May of 1945. Hatcher went home to Pennsylvania, to Dorothy, and the daughter who was 3 years older than in her pictures. He got a job in the mine, lived a quiet life, never wore his uniform again except for Veterans Day. He died in 1987, at the age of 75. At his funeral, 3 men in their 60s stood together in the back of the church. Mitchell, Turner, Hayes, the last survivors of that night in the field. They didn't say much, just stood together, remembering. After the service, Mitchell approached Dorothy. He was an old man now, retired teacher, grandfather of 5. "Your husband saved my life," he said simply. "I wanted you to know that. Not just me, 40 of us. We should all be names on a memorial wall, but we're not, because of him." Dorothy smiled, sad and proud. "He never told me the whole story." "He wouldn't," that was Bill. "But I'm telling you now, what he did that night, it was extraordinary. He took a broken headlight and turned it into salvation. He saw what no one else could see, and he had the courage to try something completely insane. Did he get recognition? A medal?" Mitchell shook his head. The Army didn't know what to make of it. Too strange to fit in a citation, too unorthodox for official commendation. But those of us who were there, we knew. We told our children, our grandchildren. The story is not forgotten. And it wasn't. In American Legion halls and VFW posts, the story of the sergeant in the headlight became legend, embellished, exaggerated, but rooted in truth. Historians would later try to verify it, search through after-action reports and Luftwaffe records. They found references, vague mentions of unusual Allied activity, pilots reporting contradictory signals, night operations called off due to uncertainty about ground defenses. But nothing definitive. Nothing that proved it happened exactly the way the survivors said. Maybe that's appropriate. War is chaos. The real stories, the human stories, don't always make it into official records. They live in memory instead. Passed from one generation to the next, changed and shaped by time, but never quite forgotten. Because the story isn't really about a headlight. It's about something deeper. It's about the moment when everything is lost and you find a way anyway. It's about ingenuity born of desperation. It's about the quiet heroes who never sought glory but saved lives anyway. It's about a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania who understood that sometimes the best weapon isn't firepower, it's understanding. Sometimes survival isn't about being stronger or faster. It's about being smarter, more creative, more human. In the end, that's what war comes down to. Not the battles in the history books or the strategies taught at war colleges, but the individual moments, the split-second decisions, the sergeants standing in dark fields with Jeep headlights, gambling everything on an idea that probably won't work, but might, just might, be crazy enough to succeed. Hatcher never wanted to be remembered as a hero, but he is, not in monuments or history books, but in the quiet memories of the men he saved, in the children and grandchildren who exist because 40 soldiers came home from a war that should have killed them. That's the real legacy. Not medals or commendations, but life, continued, saved, protected by a man who saw death coming and answered with a light in the darkness. The war produced millions of stories. Most are forgotten, but some endure. This one endures because it captures something essential about the human spirit, the refusal to surrender, the creativity that emerges in crisis, the bond between soldiers that transcends fear. In a black night in 1944, in a muddy field somewhere in France, a sergeant named William Hatcher stood with a Jeep headlight and created a miracle. Not through supernatural power or divine intervention, but through understanding, through courage, through the simple, profound act of refusing to let his soldiers die. The Luftwaffe flew away that night, confused and cautious. 40 men climbed out of ditches and lived to see morning. History moved on, as history does, toward victory and peace, and the slow work of rebuilding. But in that one moment, on that one field, one man proved that ingenuity is a weapon, that creativity can defeat overwhelming force, that sometimes the difference between death and survival is nothing more than a light in the darkness and the courage to use it. That's the story. That's the legacy. And that's why decades later we remember a sergeant who saved 40 lives with nothing but a headlight, quick thinking, and the kind of bravery that doesn't announce itself but simply acts when action is needed most.